Hi, I'm Shan Wu with a Under Color of Law hot take on the protective pardon. So I've been discussing with you the pardon power as being a weapon that President Biden can wield very freely and very powerfully. And indeed, the SCOTUS immunity decision, that terrible decision that created presidential immunity out of whole cloth, made it clear that the pardon power is a core power. Some legal experts disagree with that analysis, saying SCOTUS got it wrong. What's new with that? That's a growing phenomenon on the part of the Supreme Court. Nonetheless, they made it very clear. They think the pardon power is completely a core power of the presidency, and they can do anything they want with it, even so far as to suggest that if there was a bribe given to bestow a pardon, can't do anything about that either. The bribe maybe by itself could be prosecuted, but the pardon power itself can't touch it. So let's talk about this concept then of the protective pardon. Now, I'd suggested in a Daily Beast article that I wrote that Biden could go a lot further and protect people who might be persecuted by the incoming regime. And now Politico is reporting that the White House staff is doing exactly that. They're considering the idea of issuing pardons to those in danger from the incoming Trump regime. Now, we need to understand that the scope and wording of that is a little challenging. So let's talk first about a common error that the media is making in calling these preemptive pardons. I get why they're saying that, but there's no real distinction of that nature about pardons. There's just pardons. And there's no legal reason that a recipient has to be first charged or convicted. Better term would be protective pardons, or some people have also suggested the idea of a safe harbor term for the pardon. That really conveys the point of it. But the scope is also complicated. So for example, let's say a pardon was issued to Merrick Garland, Liz Cheney. How far down, how deep would that go? Would it also protect their staff people? Maybe Trump should simply protect the entire Department of Justice. Now, the broader the pardon goes, of course, the more outrage from MAGA world, and therefore more likely it could wind its way up to the Supreme Court if they wanted to weigh in. So it's a balancing question. But there's a great value in starting the fight, which is what Democrats need to do. Now, let's remember that there is some precedent for a really broad pardon. And one of the concerns you have is if you name specific people, are you creating a target list? I mean, the likely incoming FBI director, at least the one that Trump wants to be the FBI director, Kash Patel, has already published a book which essentially has an enemies list. That's gotten a lot of publicity. I'm not going to put it up there. I don't want to further that kind of talk. But if you named individual people, maybe you're causing the same problem for them, putting a target on their back. Now, President Jimmy Carter gave pardons to people from the Vietnam era who had been so-called draft dodgers. And he did that without naming all the people. He just basically put that out there. So that is a model for that to be used. The recipient does have to accept the pardon, kind of unclear when they must accept it, but certainly if there is a prosecution brought, they need to raise it publicly in court about that. So that's a possible model to look at. Now, even some conservatives have suggested that maybe President Biden needs to pardon other family members of his as well. So let's take a listen here to our friends at Fox.
The one thing I do think is going to happen is that I think there are more Bidens that will get some of these pardons. James Biden and some of the other family members, I think, are in legal jeopardy. And that's been pointed out in Congress. I mean, that comes from James Comer. Comer has been laying this out. And that's where I think that pardons that come in maybe January 19th or even the morning of January 20th will include more Bidens.
Now, I don't think it's going too far to think about that, because after all, maybe it's not just Hunter Biden who might be in danger. And if we take a listen to another commentator from MSNBC, a New York Times opinion writer, you'll see that she spells out exactly that concern.
It's not ideal to have an incoming potential head of the FBI, Kash Patel, who has published enemies lists. But one advantage of that is that he wrote a book, he has an enemies list in it, so we know exactly who he has threatened to go after without cause. Just pardon everyone on it.
It's definitely not going too far when you have essentially this enemies list. And in fact, I believe just recently, Kash Patel had his lawyer send a letter to Olivia Troy saying that you're saying I'm not qualified to be the FBI director, we're suing you. I mean, that whole kind of approach smacks of retribution, revenge, and so that's why you would really want to take seriously the idea that they're going to go after particular people. Now, a number of leading scholars, some of them got together and wrote an opinion piece in Newsweek about this pardon issue. It includes Professor Kim Well, who has written a book about the pardon power. We'll put up a screenshot of Kim's book. It's available on Amazon. I don't even get a cut of any promotion. She and the fellow commentators point out that in a perfect world, Congress would pass legislation barring politically motivated cases. Now you might say, oh, isn't that already true? You can't have selective prosecution. Here's the problem. The elements of selective prosecution are pretty narrow. It's hard to show. That's why you don't get a lot of those cases brought successfully. These experts make the case that those elements are too narrow, especially for the kind of abuse of power that Trump has been wielding and plans to yield in his new regime. And they're pointing out, look, it'd be great to have that, but it's unlikely that Congress is going to move in order to do that. But that concept's important, that you need something much broader to protect people. Now, another point to make is, speaking of broad pardon powers, is President Biden could do a lot by dovetailing his pardon of Hunter Biden for that drug offense, or rather the failing to disclose he was using drugs for the firearm registration. It's a drug offense because he was a drug user. He was an addict at that time. And you could also look to pardon some of the 3,000 people in federal prison right now for marijuana-related crimes. So there's a lot of nonviolent offenders who oftentimes are subject to laws that really don't make much sense anymore. Those will also be very good candidates to use the pardon power for. And I've suggested that a real power move right now would be to pardon Trump himself. That's not protective. He's already, first of all, he doesn't need too much protection. He's got all the protection he needs from institutionalists who have moved too cautiously, would move too cautiously and slowly because they don't really want to believe that a Trump-type figure can be a real threat in the United States of America. They're being proven wrong every day. He also doesn't need the protection because the Supreme Court's conservative majority has given him great protection. So this would not be a protective pardon, but it would be a pardon for someone who is already charged. And perhaps most importantly, it carries with it a presumption of some wrongdoing. Historical footnote. President Gerald Ford, who famously pardoned President Nixon, Ford carried in his wallet for many years a newspaper clipping from a 1915 Supreme Court case, Burdick versus United States, in which the Supreme Court said that pardons carry, quote, imputation of guilt, unquote, and that accepting the pardon is, quote, a confession of it, the guilt. Ford apparently carried that with him because he felt that his action in making the pardon was being justified by the fact that there was now historical record of really what amounted to an official accusation of President Nixon, and that Nixon was in many ways confessing to it morally, if not legally, by accepting the pardon. I think that's why he carried around that article, because he knew it was not going to be a popular decision, and the ensuing years certainly borne that out. I mean, he was very roundly criticized for that. At the time, people were outraged over it. Bob Woodward, of the fabled team Woodward and Bernstein, who broke the Watergate story and really were the catalyst for the entire Watergate scandal that forced Nixon to resign. Woodward was supposedly furious at news of the pardon, saying, in the quote, "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch." unquote. Yet, in hindsight, we can see that Ford's action did require a certain kind of courage. There are people who say, oh, it was just a deal. He was going to get the presidency from Nixon in order to pardon him. Yeah, okay, maybe that's true. But Ford would have had ambitions, and he did have ambitions, having gotten the presidency, to run on his own terms and win it. And he would have known that the pardon was going to hurt that, and he was right. Decades later, actually, he received a Profile in Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library that hands out those awards that singled out that decision to make the pardon. And he always believed that that cost him the presidency, which he lost in 1976 to President Jimmy Carter. President Biden doesn't have to worry about that. And more importantly, it is part of taking the fight to the incoming regime, which is so critical for us to do. So that's it for now. Good to talk to you. Thank you again for all the replies and comments. They're really helpful to see, and really enjoy getting to engage with you there, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.